There is a moment, somewhere in the far north, when a man's breath stops rising. It doesn't drift. It doesn't curl. It simply hangs in the air in front of his face, frozen where it left his mouth. That is the world we are stepping into tonight. So what if everything you think you know about the Vikings is wrong? What if they were not the storm on the horizon, not the axe in the night, but the last people standing in a world that was quietly trying to erase them? And what if the thing that made Europe tremble was never their cruelty at all, but something far more uncomfortable? Because here is the truth, that archaeology is only now dragging out of the frozen ground. Europe didn't fear them because they were savage. Europe feared them because they were prepared. And, in their finest blades, buried inside the steel itself, there are two words that no historian has ever fully explained. We'll come back to those. But there is something else I need you to hold on to, because it changes everything. There was one Viking colony that mastered all of this. The homes, the steel, the ships, the system. They did everything right for nearly 500 years, and they still froze to death. Their story is the one that should frighten us most, and it's waiting for us at the end. So look at the world that built them. In northern Norway, the sun does not merely set in winter. It leaves for almost 2 months. Temperatures collapse toward 30 below. The growing season, the narrow window that decides whether a family eats or buries, lasts less than 4 months of the year. Everything else is darkness, ice, and arithmetic. And that raises a question we have somehow never learned to ask. What kind of world builds a human being like that? The answer begins with a child. A Viking child never chose to become a warrior. The land chose for them, long before they were old enough to argue. In the pale blue light of a winter morning, boys and girls trained side by side, their breath rising like smoke signals, their small fingers aching around a bow that was never a toy. Archery was not a sport. It was insurance against hunger. Elbow high, a father would say, his voice low and patient. Breathe. Let it fly like your life depends on it. And he was not being poetic. Because one winter, it would. And this is not sentiment invented for a documentary you can read it in their bones. When researchers examine Norse skeletons from this era, they find bone density and muscle attachment points that outmatch almost anything else in medieval Europe. The physical signature of bodies that began real, load-bearing work by the age of 7 or 8. These were not children who played at survival. They were part of the machine that produced it. And if you think that machine only shaped the boys, then you don't yet know about a grave called Birka BJ 581. For more than a century, it was the textbook image of the Viking warrior, a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, 2 horses, buried with the honors of a fighting elite. And then, in 2017, DNA testing gave an answer nobody was prepared for. The warrior was a woman, buried beside her, a full set of gaming pieces, the tools of battlefield strategy. Not a soldier, a commander. So, if the coldest place in Europe could forge that, then imagine what it did to their steel. Step into the smoke of the forge and you'll hear it. The slow heartbeat of hammer on anvil, the hiss of a blade meeting water. A master smith did not simply shape metal. He listened to it. The balance is perfect, he'd murmur, dragging a calloused thumb along a glowing edge. It sings. And here is the part the legends always miss, because it isn't romantic, it's engineering. Ordinary iron shatters in extreme cold. Brittle steel snaps like glass at 30 below. So they built their swords in layers, a soft, flexible core welded inside a hard, high-carbon edge. The blade bends when it should break, and holds its bite when everything else in the world has frozen solid. And then there are the ones that shouldn't exist at all. Roughly 170 blades have been found carrying a single word hammered into the metal: Ulfbert. Crucible steel, so pure, so free of impurity, that European forgers would not reliably reproduce it for another 800 years. Nobody knows who Ulfbert was. A man, a workshop, a bloodline the name has never been solved. We only know one thing for certain. It was written the way a person writes their name when they are willing to be held responsible for what they made. And that tells you everything. They weren't signing weapons, they were signing promises. But a promise is only as good as the season it has to survive. And in the north, there was only ever one true enemy. Not kingdoms, not armies. Winter. Winter was not a season up there. It was a predator, and it hunted with patience. It didn't strike, it waited, month after month, for a single mistake. and so the hunt became something closer to a ritual than a chore. In the stillness of early snow, men spread out through the trees with the same discipline they would one day carry into battle. Surround the target, press the flank, close every escape, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. And when the stag finally went down into the white, the hunt didn't end, it changed. A rough hand pressed gently into fur that was still warm, breath drifted upward, and quiet words of thanks were spoken to something unseen in the forest. To modern ears, that sounds like superstition, but listen closer, because it's the opposite. The meat would feed them through the darkest months. The hide became a wall against the wind. The bones became tools. The sinew became bowstrings. Nothing taken without purpose, nothing thrown away. And that is the thing we get wrong about them, again and again. A people who live 1 week from starvation do not learn to hate the world. They learn to thank it. Then the snow closed the roads, and survival stopped being a story and became a calculation. Food was smoked, salted, and sealed away with something close to reverence. It was divided by need, not by desire, because one act of greed, one moment of quiet selfishness, could kill an entire village by March. The cold is patient, the elders would say. We must keep order. That wasn't philosophy. That was arithmetic, written in frost and hunger. And it shaped a society that would have astonished the rest of Europe, if the rest of Europe had ever bothered to look. While most of the continent lived under lords who owned them, the Norse gathered at the thing an open assembly where a farmer could stand and speak, and be heard. In Iceland, they founded the Althing in the year 930, and it is still running today, one of the oldest parliaments left standing on this planet. And their law carried a clause that will tell you exactly what kind of world they lived in. Hoarding food during a famine was punished with a severity approaching that of killing a man. Because in a Viking winter, those two things were never really different. So the sword was never the secret. The system was. Archaeology can pull almost all of it back out of the ground. Their ships, their bones, their blades, their halls. Everything they ever touched, except one thing. And that one thing is waiting for us at the end. Because if the system was the secret, then you can walk inside it. The warmest room in medieval Europe was not in a castle. It had no stone tower, no glass, no tapestries. It was a house built out of dirt. Step into a Viking longhouse, and at first glance, it looks almost primitive. A long, dim hall, a fire running down the center, families pressed shoulder to shoulder in the smoke. But that simplicity is a disguise, because what you are standing inside is not a shelter. It's a machine. Start with the walls. In Iceland and the far north, those turf walls could run up to 2 meters thick, and that thickness was never about strength, it was about air. Packed earth and layered turf trap thousands of tiny pockets of still air, and still air is the finest insulator the pre-industrial world ever had. The floor was often sunk below ground level, not to hide, but to borrow the steady, patient warmth of the earth itself. The long central hearth was engineered to heat people, not room's radiant heat, thrown directly onto skin and wool and bone. And above it, the smoke vents did something almost elegant. Rising smoke pulled a slow, continuous current through the hall, drawing stale air up and fresh air in through the gaps at the doors. A circulation system with no electricity, no fan, no moving part. And the result of all of it, on a night when the world outside stood at 30 below, was a room where a family could sit and eat and live. There were no private bedrooms in that hall. 3 generations slept in a single space, breathing the same smoke, hearing every cough and every whisper. And that was not a failure of design. That was the design. They did not survive the cold by escaping each other. They survived it by refusing to, and the same instinct sailed with them. They crossed open ocean with no maps and no magnetic compass, but with a sun compass to hold a latitude, and possibly with something stranger still, a sunstone, a crystal of calcite that polarizes light and can pull the sun's position out of a solid sheet of cloud. That is how they found land that no one in Europe believed was there. And we know exactly when, because a burst of cosmic radiation left a scar in the tree rings of the wood they cut. The year was 1021. Norse feet stood in North America at Lansor Meadows 471 years before Columbus ever left port. And when they came home, they lit the lamps and lifted the first horn of ale, and the hall filled with stories of sea dragons, of gods, of warriors who fought until the waves themselves seemed to bleed. To an outsider, myths. To a Viking, emotional blueprints teaching courage and loyalty and the cost of cowardice. Someday, the elders would say, leaning into the firelight, the skalds will sing of you too. But every system has a limit, and theirs was about to be found. But before we get there, there is one last thing to find in that hole, the thing archaeology can never pull out of the ground. Because when the feast finally quieted, and the fire fell from roaring flame to slow orange ember, the Vikings became something the sagas almost never bothered to record. They became parents. Good night, little one. Good night, mother. Sleep well. And in that small exchange, the myth simply dissolves. The sword cooling by the hearth stops looking like a weapon and starts looking like a promise, the reason all of it existed in the first place. We can recover their ships and their bones and their blades. We can map every ocean they crossed and every man they buried. But we will never recover the lullabies whispered in the dark, the soft laughter between a parent and a child, the tenderness that lived behind all that iron. And perhaps that is the real mystery. That a people feared across continents could come home, set down the axe, and love that fiercely. So now let me take you back to that colony I promised you. Around the year 985, the Norse sailed to Greenland. And they thrived. Turf farms, cattle, sheep, stone churches for nearly 500 years. They made a life at the edge of the habitable world. Then the climate turned against them. The ice crept south, the grass stopped growing, the cattle began to starve. And here is the part that should stop your breath. They were not alone out there. The Inuit were surviving the very same cold hunting seal, wearing skins built for the water, moving by kayak through ice the Norse ships could not touch. The knowledge was right there, in front of them, for generations. And the archaeological record tells us, almost silently, that the Norse barely took any of it. They held on to their cattle. They held on to their sheep. They held on to the way of life that had saved their grandfathers in a Europe that no longer existed. And then they vanished. They didn't die because they were weak. They died because they stopped adapting. And adaptation was the one thing that ever made them Vikings in the first place. So this was never a story about conquest. Conquest fades. Empires rot. What endured was the thing they built. Homes that breathed with the storms. Steel that bent instead of breaking. And a community that shared its risk instead of hoarding it. Greenland didn't fall to an enemy. It fell to good people who kept doing what used to work. Which leaves the only question that really matters tonight. Not whether your winter is coming, it always is, but whether you are still holding on to a way of living that the world has already left behind. If the forgotten truths of the past can teach us how to face what's ahead, then this journey is far from over. Like, share, and subscribe to Dark Origins, not just to uncover history, but to learn what it's still trying to tell us.